We're now up to Daf Samach Zayin Amid Beis, and the Gemara says Kol Makom de Seifa. When it says in our Mishnah Kol Makom that whenever there's an Avera and it's an illegitimate marriage, the Vlad is miyuchas to the pogum of the two, of the male and the female, the father and the mother, is Lasuye, the Kol Makom is coming as a ribui for Ger Shenasa Mamzeres, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Because Rabbi Yehuda does not allow a Ger to marry a Mamzeres, because a Ger is also considered Kahal Yisrael, and therefore he's included under Lav of Lo Yovo Mamzer B'Kal Hashem. And the Vlad is going to be Miyuchas Le'imo, right, who's the Mamzeres, and he's going to be a Mamzer. That's what it comes out. So that's a case which fits into the second klal of the Mishnah, that whenever there's an illegitimate marriage, the Vlad goes after the Pogum. Here, where according to Rabbi Yehuda, a Ger marries a Mamzeres, that's an illegitimate marriage, and no, foul marriage. And the Vlad indeed goes after the Pogum, which is the mother. So that's hinted at in the Mishnah when the Mishnah says Kol Makom. Ela'i Amrit. But if you're going to say, like the second answer the Gemara offered, that the Mishnah reflects a Shita Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Yossi holds that a Ger is allowed to marry a Mamzeres because Kahal Gerim Eino Korui Kahal. Then we have trouble with the Mishnah. Why? Because Kol Makom de Reisha Kidamar. I can square away with the Kol Makom in the Reisha, as we said before, that in the case of Yisrael, who marries a Chalala, so that's the Ribui, and that's a legitimate marriage, and yet the Vlad is Holech Achar Pogum. No, I'm sorry. In the case of, let's just go over it one more time, a Yisrael Shenasa Chalala, yeah. We're going to have a Mishnah later on that, no, that's a case, yeah, a Chalal who marries what? No. A Yisrael, I'm sorry, I got confused. Yisrael Shenasa Chalala. Yeah. And we said that, here it is. A Yisrael Shenasa Chalala, on the bottom of Samach Zayin Amid Aleph, we said that the Kiddushin is Mutarim, that's for sure, and the Vlad is Miyuchas Li Aviv. So he's not a Chol. And if it's a female, she can marry a Kohen. And that's included under the Kol Makom de Reisha, where the Nisu in the marriage is legitimate, it's mutar, and the child therefore goes boss of the father. And therefore she's not a Chalol. And then Ezuzu, and what is the exclusion and the miyut of Ezuzu in the Reisha? Kidamaran, that's going to be the case of a Ger Amoni who married a Gioris Mitzris, and the Nesuin is mutter, yet the Vlad is miyuchas to the Pogum. That was the sheet of Ravin. Or let's say Mitzri Sheni, Shenosa, and he's allowed to marry a Mitzri Rishona. The Vlad is miyuchas Le'imo, and he's a Mitzri Sheni. That was the sheet of Rabdimi. And all that was excluded under Ezazu. So that even though the marriage was legitimate, nevertheless, the Vlad is miyuchas to the mother, according to Abdini. Ella kol makom de seifa lasuye mad. However, we're going to have trouble when we get to the seifa. Right, the seifa says that if it's an illegitimate marriage, the Vlad holech acharad av, or if the pogum is the mother. And what's the kol makom coming to include? The Mishnah actually spells out all the cases. doesn't leave us hanging with any additional case. That whenever there's an aver in the Nesuin, the Vladas means Yachis Lepogum. And the case of a ger shenosam amzeres, according to Rabbi Yossi, is not relevant because he also ger is a ladder marry of mamzer, so it's not an aver b'nesuin. So the Gemara answers l'taimeich. You want to make a diuk from the Sefer of the Mishnah? Well, if you're right that even the Lashonos in the Sefer are coming either to be marba or to be mayit, so then li Rabbi Yehuda, if we explain our Mishnah according to Rabbi Yehuda, who prohibits a marriage between a ger and a mamzeres, so that means it's in an illegitimate marriage, and the vlad is holech hakar pogum, has the status of a mamzer. So then ezu de seifa lomali. What is the ezu in the seifa? Seifa means where it's an illegitimate marriage, and we're going according to Rabbi Yehuda that a ger is not allowed to marry a mamzeres. Is lomali. There's no one to exclude. Because again, the vlad is going to be holech hakar pogum, and the vlad is going to be a mamzer. Elo, you have no choice. But I did Tani Reisha, Tani, right? Tani Reisha Ezazu, Tani the Sefer Ezazu. And Hachanavi here too will say I did Tani Reisha Kol Makom is Tani Nami B'Sefer Kol Makom. So the Gemara ends this sugya. It's a little bit anticlimactic by saying that sometimes it's the symmetry of the Mishnah. The Mishnah wants to be consistent. So even when Kol Mokum doesn't add anything, it uses the phrase Kol Mokum. Even the Ezazu doesn't exclude anything, it will still be consistent and use the term Ezazu. Gufa, now the Gemara goes back to what we learned on Daf Samad Zayin Amid Aleph in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. That a Vlad of Goyim from two different nations is the Vlad is miyuchas ki osa rovin Rabbi Yochanan sheba umos halach achar zoch. The Vlad is miyuchas to the zocher. So that means that if a Frenchman marries a Knanis, there's no mitzvah vis-a-vis the child of lo sechai kol nishom, because the Vlad is holech achar zoch. That's what it goes in the Uma's whole. Niskairu, let's say these parents, the father and the mother, right? He was a Frenchman and she was a Knanis. They undergo gerus. Halach achar pogum shebishneim. So then we determine who's the pogum. Oh, same thing as this is a problem. I have to get someone to fix that for me. Anyway, so what's going to be the deal if there was gerus? So hakol holech achar pogum. I don't know what that means. So Gemara is going to clarify this. My be'umos halach achar zochar, and then the Gemara is going to clarify my be'umos shenis gairu holech achar pogum. It is Sanya. So a Frenchman had a relationship with a Knanis. For a holy ben. And from that relationship, a son was born. How do we know that you're allowed to leave the child alive as an evet? which means that he's considered a guy, but from the Frenchman, not from the Goyter who's a Knanis, which we would have to put him to death. How do we know this? Talmud Lomar, he tells you here it's Vayikra Chaf Hey, and the pasuk says, "Me'eis hagoyim asher svivosechem mehem tiknu eved v'ama." So we're talking about umas ha'olam outside of Eretz Yisrael that are purchasing avodim. The Torah says, "V'gam mibnei atoshavim hagarim imachem mehem tiknu." Do you have by chance a translation of that in English?
Bahem tiknu. 1 second, I'm looking.
You should say, and also the children of the settlers or something like that, who live amongst the Jewish people, you can acquire ownership on those, something loosely like that.
Bahem tiknu, yeah. The verse states, and also of the children of the residents who sojourn with you, of them you may buy.
You may buy. So in other words, even though the children of Goyim that came from Chutz La'aretz and they're now living and dwelling, sojourning with you, living with you in Eretz Yisrael, you could be kona them as avodim. For example, let's say a Frenchman had a relationship in Chutz La'aretz with a Knanis, or shall we say, he was a Frenchman in Chutz La'aretz. Now he comes to live in Israel, and he has a relationship with a Knanis in Eretz Yisrael. So the ben of such a relationship is an Eved, and you could be Mechaya him. You don't have to put him to death, despite the fact that his mother's a Knanis. So we see that the Vlad is not miyuchas to his mother, who's a Knanis, but rather to his father, who belongs to the other nations. So the Mehem Tiknu is teaching you that you're allowed to keep him alive and acquire him as an Eved. Yachol, the Brisa continues, I might think that maybe the reason why you're allowed to keep him alive has nothing to do with the fact that his father is a Frenchman. Af Knani Shabbat, I think it should be Shifcha Achas. No. Shifcha Achas, he says, is Mishar HaUmos, I think. Well, Achas, you should read it like this. Leave out the word Shifcha. Al Achas Mishar Umos V'holid Ben. So now the father is a Knani, the mother is a French woman, and they have a child. You're allowed to leave him alive, even though his father is what? Is a Knani. Because the mother is not a Knanis. She's not from the 7 Palestinian nations. Tamalom asher holidu bi artzachem, min anoladim bi artzachem, v'lo min hagarim bi artzachem. So anyway, before we get into the nitty-gritty details of how to darshan this pasuk, asher holidu bi artzachem, let's just fast forward, jump ahead of ourselves. What's the bottom line of this brisa? The halacha is that if the father's a Knani and the mother is mi'umos ha'olam, we have to put him to death. The child has to be put to death. That's what we're going to derive from the pasuk, asher holidu bi'artzachem. That if it was no lodu bi'artzachem, which means that the mother was from Eretz Yisrael, the father was from other nations, so the mother was a Knani. Then we have to put the child to death. But lo min hagarim bi'artz, then we can keep the child alive. Because the father determines the yichus. But in a case of a father who's a Knani and the mother is Mishar Uhumos, the Vlad has to be put to death. like the father. He's a Kanani. And that's what Rabbi Yochanan meant when he said that umos miyachsim es havladli aviv. So in other words, if the father is a Frenchman, then you're allowed to be Kona the Eved, who's the son of his marriage with a Kananis. But if the father is the Kanani, then the son has the same status as a Kanani and has to be put to death. Nisgairu halach achra pogum shebishnein. So if the father and the mother were both misgayer, then the Vlad who's born after the Gerus is miyuchas to the pogum shebishnein. B'mai. What is the scenario that Rabbi Yochanan had in mind? Elam, if we're going to say ger mitzri, shenasa giores amonis. So they were both misgayer. He is a mitzri, she's an amonis. Now the Torah says amoni velo amonis. So an amonis is not excluded from Kal Yisrael if she undergoes gerus. So what's going to be the status of the child? And then we're going to apply the principle of Rabbi Yochanan in the Havamina, this Havamina, that the Vlad is miyuchas to the pogum shebishneim, which in this case would be the mitzri, if I understand correctly, because in Dar Shlishi, you need to wait 2 more generations. So the Gemara asks, my pogum ika. The mother's a Giores from Ammoni. So she's allowed to come to Kal Yisrael. So what does Rabbi Yochanan say when he says that Shneim Pgumim? It can't be Shneim Pgumim if the mother is an Ammonis. Ammoni velo Ammonis. Right, that was the whole pulmus, between David David, whether we could allow him to come into Kal Yisrael because he came from Rus, who was a Moaviyah. Ella says the Gemara, no, it's a case of Ger Ammoni Shenosa Gioris Mitzvus. So the father is an Ammoni, that's a problem. The mother, on the other hand, is a Mitzvus. So on the mother's side, when we get to the grandchildren, Dar Shlishi, they can marry into the Jewish people. But on the father's side, he's an Ammoni. Then for all generations to come, the children cannot marry. The Zachar Havihai, let's say the Vlad is a male, Shadya Abasre Dide. He's going to be Muchas to his father who's an Ammoni. And he, never could come into Kal Yisrael. The Im Nikeva Avi, let's say the product, meaning the girl who's born to this marriage between an Ammoni ger and a Mitzvus ger is Shadia Basri Dida. So the mother is a Mitzvus. That means that the Vlad, or his Vlad, meaning the grandchildren, are allowed to come to Kol. So again, how does this fit into Rabbi Yochanan's words? I'm just trying to figure that out. Right, Rabbi Yochanan said that what? that Nizgairu halach achar pogum shebeshneim. So why is the child of this marriage between an Ammoni and a Mitzris, why is the child considered a Mitzri? One second. Oh, I think I got it. Im nekeva havi, if the prodigy of a marriage between a ger Ammoni and a gioris Mitzris is a female, then if we consider the father, then this girl is allowed to marry a Jewish person. Why? Because the Torah says, Ammoni lo yova b'kal Hashem v'lo Ammonis. So she's an Ammonis if she's miyuches to the father. If on the other hand she's miyuches to the mother, then she's a mitzvah shniya, and she can't marry Jewish people. So therefore, according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says that Nizgairu is halach achar pogum shebishneim, now the pogum shebishneim is dafka the mitzvahs, not the Ammoni, because the Ammoni's daughter is an Ammonis, and she's allowed to marry into the Jewish people again if there's gerus. The Mishnah says, "Kol she'ein love, ein lo love Kiddushin. Aval yesh al acherim Kiddushin is avlad mamzer." And what is the case? That's habal achas mikol harayos shebetorah. So it means if ein Kiddushin tovsin, because she's an erva, and the owners for that relation is kares, then the vlad that's born from that bias isa kares is a mamzer. If that vlad that was born from a bias surah b'kares is a mamzer, and as the Gemara says in Yevamas on Daf Mem Tesamid Beis, that we derive this from the Smichus HaPosuk. Right, the pasuk says that a man is not allowed to have relations with Eishes Achi Aviv, and that's an Onish Kares. And then it says Mamzer Lo Yova B'Kal Hashem. So Mamzer is not allowed to marry Bas Yisrael. So the Gemara asks me, Nani Milu. How do we know that if there's an Iser Erev of Kares, there's no Tfisas Kiddushin? Tiyom Rav Chia bar Abba Rav Yochanan Umati ba mishum de Rav Yanai, Rav Acha brei de Rava, Umatale mishum Rav Yosef Glili, Omar Kra. The Torah says in Parshas Ki Tetzei, after a man divorces his wife, he yotza mi beisa. V'ol chavoi solish acher, and the language of V'hoisa is a language of Kiddushin. In other words, that after he gives her a get, she can marry an ish acher. But it says ish acher, apparently excluding someone else, v'lo l'krov. So it means the krovim have an erva relationship with her, and hence there's no tfisas kiddushin. And that gives us the principle of ein kiddushin tosa b'chayve krisis. Maskif la Rabbi Abba. How do you know that this pasuk is coming to teach us that she cannot be married to a krovim? Emoli acher v'lo leben. Maybe when the Torah says v'holcha v'hoisa lish acher, it's coming to exclude the son of her husband, because he's the closest to her. And that's a chiyuv misas bezdin. So you cannot derive, asks the Gemara, the principle of En Kiddushin Tos V'Chai V'Krisus if the exclusion here is to the ben of her husband, because that's a Chiv Mises Bezdin. But maybe in the case of a Chiv Karis, there would be Tfisus Kiddushin. So the Gemara answers, no, it can't be that Liacher is excluding the ben, because Beheja, ben Beheja Ksid Bey. Pasuk says, Lo Yikach Ish es Eshes Aviv. Right, the ben of the husband, if he takes her, that means the wife of his father, that's Eshes Aviv. So therefore, the pasuk of Haisal Ish Acher Lomali El Shmam, Acherim V'lo Lekrovim, even those krovim that are only Asur Bekaris. V'ema Idi V'idi Leben Halechatchila V'ha B'di'evet. So when the pasuk says Lo Yikach Ish Es Eshes Aviv, which is an Isur of Ben Baila, that's only L'chatchila. But B'di'evet, we can derive from the pasuk of Haisal Ish Acher that even B'di'evet, if he violates this Isur, and the Ben went ahead and he was Makadesh, his father's wife, then Ein Kiddushin Tovsim Ba. So in other words, we need two psukim from Ben Baila. We need a lechatchila to tell me that it's asur, and we need a b'di'evet to tell me that even if they violated the isur, there's no tfisas kiddushin. And the Gemara answers that we don't need a pasuk for the Ben marrying his father's wife. Lechatchila, that we can derive from achos isha nafka. Why? Ma'achos isha bekares. He marries his wife's sister. That's a chiv kares. Lo to kaddish. Maybe Mrs. Bezdin. So 1 second. Where do we put the comma here? L'chatchila me'achos isha nafka. Ma'achos isha, which is only an isa kares. And the Torah says lo tekadesh. Is chayim mises bezel kolshke. How much more so l'chatchila it's also to be kaddish. So therefore, the bottom line here is that lo yikach ishes eshes aviv is coming to teach me that even b'di'evid, the kiddushin of a ben to his father's wife is ein kiddushin tovsin. And the pasuk of Haisal Ish Acher teaches that there's no tfisas kiddushin even in shar krovim that are asurimi din kares. In fact, the Gemara v'ema idi v'idi b'achos isha halachatchila hab b'di'evet, the same question that we asked before, and the Gemara says eino chinam. So we have to interpret v'haisal ish acher. It's not coming to exclude ein kiddushin tovsim be'achos isha. And we're going to have to ask the kasha, ashkechan achos isha shar arayos minolan. Okay, you found that there's no tfis kiddushin in achos isha, because the pasuk says the isha lachos alosika. But Shara Rayas Minolan. maybe it's a separate din in Achos Isha that ain't Kiddushin Tovsa. How do you know that any erva is excluded? Alfinon mi Achos Isha. Ma Achos Isha miuchedeshi erva. Chayoven als dona koris. Balshig gosa chatos below tafsi ba Kiddushin, because the Torah says lo sika. Is let's derive from there that af kol shehi erva. In other words, Achos Isha is an erva. Any erva. Chayav els dona koris gosa chatos below tafsi ba Kiddushin. So the makar, the source of the din of our Tana and our Mishnah, that whenever there's an Isa Karis, there's no Tfis Kiddushin, is right here. Gemara asks Bishlema, Kulu Asyan. I can derive all our rayos from Achos Isha, Ela Eshes Ish Veshes Ach. That's not comparable because Eshes Ach has a heter b'makom yibum, and Eshes Ish has a heter when there's a get. Equal and mifrach. Malachos Isha shekein lo heter b'makom mitzvah. Right, you'll never have a mitzvah to marry the sister of your wife, and therefore there's no tefis kedushin. That's the chumrah of Achos Isha. Tomar can derive from that ain't kedushin tovsin v'eshes ach sheyesh laheter makom mitzvah in the case of yibum, or eshes ish nami kol mifrach malahano Achos Isha is ein lo heter b'chay osran. Tomar v'eshes ish yesh laheter b'chay osran. Thus, as long as the wife is alive, he can't marry her sister. But he could deliver a get to his wife, and therefore there'd be a heter b'chay osran. Elo Amar Rabbi Yonah v'i tamer of Huna Breder Rabbi Yeshua Makra. At the end of the parasha of Arayis, it says, Ki kol asher yaseh mikol to'evos ha'elu v'nichus ha'nafash tosos mikerev amam. And we have a lashon of Ki kol yaseh. Kol asher yaseh is hukshu kol harayos kulam liachos isha. Ma'achos isha lo tafsi ba Kiddushin. Af kol harayos kulam lo tafsi ba Kiddushin. Frek the Gemara Yehachi. And here we take a look at the top of Samachet. Afilu nida nami. Alama Amar Abaya kol modim bal hanida belasota ein avlad mamzer. What's the Gemara's kasha here? If you're saying that all the arayos that are in the parsha of arayos are hukshu zelazeh to the din of Achos Isha, then what about Baal Anida? That's also in the parsha. Or, for example, Baal Ishto Sota. And after Kini and Stira, he then went in a relationship with his wife. That's also an Isolav. Is Ein Avlad Mamzer. Okay, then this is where we'll stop. Make a note of it. Okay, then, Ben. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ravi. Thank you. Have a good Shabbos. All the best.
Have
Ravi.
a great Shabbos. Thank you so much.